This is episode 125 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico podcast. I'm Paul Gessing, president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. I'm joined today by Rio Grande Foundation policy associate and summer intern, Danny Seymour. Yes, I let the cat out of the bag. Danny, we make your title so magnificent on the website, but you are also an intern with the Rio Grande Foundation, which has its own place of honor in New Mexico.
That's got to be title 3 or 4 at this point. We've gone through a couple, but I like this one. Let's keep it. So.
All right. Well, you have been working with us since May? And
yep,
been very, very busy doing a lot of different work. But I do want to take a quick second to go behind your experience, especially given that we share essentially a hometown, not just a hometown as in the big city of Cincinnati, but we are both from a tiny little corner in the northeastern suburbs of Cincinnati. And that's where you grew up. But tell us about your journey to New Mexico.
Yeah, it's a crazy coincidence, right? Ended up here. It's been kind of a winding road. I started out in Cincinnati, obviously, first 18 years of my life. Came out here for St. John's College originally, up in Santa Fe. Went out there and spent about 2 years there. Left after that and decided to stick around. I kind of fell in love with New Mexico, Santa Fe. Spent a lot of time working various jobs up in Santa Fe. I was a bartender for a little while. I went to film school actually at Santa Fe University of Art and Design, former Santa Fe University of Art and Design at this point. Rest in peace. But old College of Santa Fe ended up changing its name and closing down. But I did cinematography and film producing up there. I've worked mainly in the gig economy, so-called, since then, just doing a lot of film jobs, bouncing around different gigs, doing a lot of producing. I produced a couple feature films and some documentaries back in the day, and then decided to come down to get my MBA at the University of New Mexico. Originally, the idea with that was to go to enhance my ability to go into the film business, but I kind of took a detour within that, getting more interested in policy and politics. I'd done some documentaries which had a heavy emphasis on the political and policy side, and that kind of spurred my interest in getting more into the nuts and bolts of what was going on, rather than simply just depicting it, being able to make these films have an impact and mean something. And so it's been kind of a winding road getting here, but it's been a great place to end up.
So you're in the midst of getting an MBA?
Just finished.
All right, finished the MBA. And you mentioned, of course, one of my favorite, the Rio Grande Foundation's favorite industries there, film. So how does somebody interested in film get to work for the Rio Grande Foundation? I guess I'll ask you that, since you're the one who's involved in film. Was that what attracted you to the foundation, that we had worked on this issue and we'd stuck our neck out on this policy issue? Or what kind of is your take on the film industry at large or in New Mexico? Because that's an interesting path there.
That's how I heard about y'all originally, actually. I won't pretend to speak for anyone else other than myself on this. These are my personal views on the matter, but the film industry isn't monolithic. And it's not all based on the out-of-state productions that come here. There's a lot of emphasis on that from the policy side, and that's where the film tax credit really comes into it. But there's a lot of people here that work independently, that are either students or young people that stuck around like myself, that really don't see much benefit coming in from that. Obviously, there's the ambient benefit of the film industry being in the state, but there really isn't like a direct benefit in the way that the industry that relies on the big productions is definitely very dependent on the film tax credit. There's a big part of the industry that is here that's kind of invisible to those policymakers that I existed in for a while as part of that. That's the independent side that really isn't involved in the film tax credit policy argument per se. And in a lot of ways, there's a kind of crowding out effect that happens. Once again, not pretending to speak for anyone other than myself here. This is just my own opinions on the matter, what I've observed over my time, is that there's a bit of a crowding out effect, that when you subsidize and emphasize a lot of the below the line crew parts of the production, the people that the films come in from out of state and I hire some crew here. When you emphasize that at the expense of anything else, and you don't really emphasize the kind of, what would you say, the productions that are made here, that are born here, that are artistically conceived here, and kind of go through the whole process here, there's a crowding out effect that happens where those productions find it harder to hire people. It's harder to actually make an impact in the film industry here because it's so dependent on the out-of-state productions that are subsidized by the tax credit. So it's definitely not a homogenous industry by any means. And there's people like me out there that feel this way, that it's not just one big thing, and we don't all think the same way about these sorts of things. So obviously, I'm a bit of an odd duck in the film industry, being opposed to this tax credit on its face. There's a lot of people that are more ambivalent towards it, and of course, many people who are strong supporters of it in the industry. But it's a mixed bag, And so I come out of I have a strange relationship to it, which I think is born of me being more towards the independent side rather than being involved in, say, the unions, for example.
All right. Well, we'll talk about the film industry itself, and that's obviously going to be a part of this conversation because for us to have a Hollywood insider on Rio Grande Foundation staff as an intern is a little unique. But before we get down that path, let's talk. You're probably a student of the industry. I hope you at least know a little bit about some of the pre-film subsidy productions that came to New Mexico, because it's kind of this lost historical fact that we didn't always have this subsidy in place. And yet film found the blue skies, the Western, vistas, etc., attractive enough to come and make some famous movies, including the original Red Dawn, the Milagro Beanfield War, which is a Robert Redford movie. There were, a handful of other movies that I can't recall off the top of my head. Oh, of course, Easy Rider, 50th anniversary of Easy Rider. Can you believe that? That's way before the subsidies. Any other movies that you want to throw out there that happened before the film subsidies? And do you have a personal favorite of any of these New Mexico films?
It was the Young Guns. Is that the Brat Pack one? Is that
okay?
That was what, Galisteo, New Mexico.
That's a good one. I don't know that
classic.
One.
Yeah,
all right.
Yeah. I mean, that's kind of a big criticism of corporate welfare in general, right? Is that it incentivizes companies to do things they would do anyway, and just gives them money after the fact to justify it. So it seems like it's throwing money at something that was already there in the name of bringing it to New Mexico for the first time. It's kind of a circular justification there.
All right, so let's dive into a little bit of the policy before we get into some of the work you've done on the issue and kind of your personal experiences, having done film in New Mexico. But you studied the film subsidy situation in New Mexico. So I guess it's worth starting at the beginning, which is that Gary Johnson is the one who initially got this thing rolling. 15 cents on the dollar was the rebate. Mm-hmm. Then Richardson came in, made it 25 cents on the dollar, unlimited cap. And so it was crazy to budget that because you had wildly disparate annual takes from the film industry. Then Susana Martinez came in. There was a loan program that never really, I don't think, your take was it a fact. It didn't seem to be a big deal for a lot of folks. In the Hollywood industry, they always had a way of making sure their films never made a profit, certainly one that you would share with the state of New Mexico. But she put the $50 million cap on it. Then we had an accumulated money that we had owed to the industry as Lujan Grisham took office here in 2019. It was, I think, close to $300 million because that cap was not, that's the amount you can accumulate. That was a cap, but you could accumulate more, and then that would theoretically be paid off in the next year and the next year after that. Of course, if you have that $50 million cap in place, you keep accumulating subsidies. So it's kind of the rolling thing that they eventually have to pay those off. And we accumulated $300 million worth. So here we are. Michelle Lujan Grisham in the last session pulled the cap off in any real terms. Certainly if you have a 10-year lease, you have like NBC Universal or Netflix has, you don't have any cap. And then she also, Martinez took it up 5% from 25 to 30 for TV shows. Theory being that Breaking Bad had done really well. You do a regular show, it's going to do more for a local economy. And then for now, under Lujan Grisham, an extra 5% potentially on top of that. So if you're doing a TV show in a rural part of New Mexico, you get up to 35%. So, but you've looked more in detail at some of the transparency issues with the film credit and other aspects of it. So why don't you talk about some of the things that you really uncovered in your work with the foundation?
Well, it's good that you mentioned the transparency aspect, because it's not transparent. I think that the best way to describe the transparency is that it doesn't exist here. It's a very opaque program, and they're making, to their credit, they've made some steps to address that. But it's remarkable considering, the Legislative Finance Committee referred to this as the largest state investment in a single industry ever. Especially considering the size of this program and the volatility it can introduce into our budgeting process. The fact that it's so opaque compared to much smaller programs that we have for economic development is just astonishing. There were some moves. There was a significant amount of press attention this year with SB2, with the expansion of the film tax credit, that claimed that this tax credit was going to be much more transparent than previous iterations. The claim was that there were additional transparency procedures and provisions in the law. Really, the only material improvement in transparency in this version of the bill is that films have to report which county or which part of the state they spent the money in. And obviously that's partially, it goes into the additional tax credit they can get for rural areas, but there haven't been real material changes in the actual reporting mechanisms that would allow economic development or anyone inside the government really to understand how this money is being spent. That's another thing with the transparency, is that most of the reporting that happens from each film is just reported, all the data is reported at the aggregate level. You're reporting the aggregate number of people you hired. You're reporting the aggregate number of hours worked. You're taking an average hours worked per person for reporting. Obviously, each of these people has to file their taxes each year, so TRD has some idea of how much money these people are being...
TRD, Tax and Revenue Department.
Tax and Revenue Department, yes.
Got to get those acronyms.
So they do have an idea of how much people are being paid, but that isn't reported to the film office, and it's not used to understand the impact of the tax credit. There's not much information that's available, especially to the public, but even within the kind of cross-departmental analysis of this, there was a bill, I'm blanking on the number of the bill, but it died in committee this year, that was supposed to give access to the Legislative Finance Committee and Economic Development to see a little bit more granular data on how the film tax credit money was being spent and what it was being spent on. That bill died. And the Legislative Finance Committee in their report on SB2 made mention of that. And they said, it's difficult for us to really take into account and understand how this money is being spent and what's being spent on. And these, mind you, these are people within the government itself who advise policymakers, don't have access to a lot of this data they would need to make a real robust econometric model, which they're now required to do. There was kind of a, lowest common denominator provision in SB2 that said EDD has to use an econometric model to estimate the effects of this tax credit. And it's like, that should have been done 20 years ago. That's like the most basic thing you can do. That's any amount of money you're spending from the government, any amount of taxpayer money that you're putting out there should be tracked, and we should understand where it's going and what effect it's having. The fact that it took all this time to get to that point is once again, it's pretty astonishing here. They made bones about it back in 2011 when they introduced the cap that is actually, at the time, I think State Senator Tim Keller, when he was in the legislature, he famously kind of came out and said, he wrote some editorials where he said, this needs to be a very transparent and very accountable program. And that they made some progress with it. Once again, they introduced a regular reporting on the website, which is reporting aggregate numbers. It's not film level data. It's not very granular, so you can't really do much with it. But that small step was kind of put into place then, which makes it sort of ironic that now Tim Keller is kind of championing the Film Partner Program. That's the NBC Universal and Netflix, which is a huge step backwards in terms of transparency for the film program as a whole.
Well, hold on. I'm going to jump in there. It's really, to me, not shocking at all, because the way the film subsidy works is that it's the state picking up the tab, but local governments do get jobs because there are jobs created with the film. It's just by no means an optimal way to create jobs. And secondly, you get some direct local government gross receipts tax revenues.
Oh yeah,
that filter in. Because of the way the gross receipts tax works, it's collected at both the state and the local government levels. So the state spends all the money on film, but local governments get some. And of course, let's face it, Tim Keller is a very left-wing progressive. He maybe took a stance on what he saw as corporate welfare at one time as a state senator, but now he is clearly angling for all the support of those progressives, and he might not have as much political incentive to stand up for good government right now.
Right, and there's a bit of an issue with. I mean, this is a short-term benefit for a long-term cost. And a lot of these people who are in government right now supporting this won't be around to see the consequences. I mean, this is a great deal for everybody except taxpayers. Like this is, films can take great advantage of this. It's a great deal for film companies to come in. It's a great deal for local politicians who get to go to the ribbon cutting ceremony, who get to say they've brought in a ton of jobs. And the actual costs of this over time, especially, I mean, we're doing fairly well economically right now because of the oil and gas boom. But if we hit any trouble, this is going to be a big problem. And those politicians who are getting the benefit of, so-called bringing in these jobs today, they're not going to be around to have to deal with the costs of this later. We are, and we're going to have to deal with that at a certain point. But they, if they're seeking higher office, especially, it looks great for them to do this.
Well, you're essentially taking money directly out of the oil and gas industry and dumping it into Hollywood. And,
right.
Given that the state is a progressively managed, governed state that wants to see more progressives support progressive industries, because face it, Hollywood is very left wing. It's all to their benefit. So if the oil and gas price were to suddenly drop or production were to go down, it would change the tune of a lot of folks in Santa Fe, perhaps, or at least it would change the reality of that situation.
Well, and that's a huge risk that comes with this too. And I think that is not something, I know you've been talking about a lot, that's not something that a lot of people understand, because I don't think this has really been reported well in the local press, is that this is a payout program. This is a cash payout program. It's not self-sustaining from a fiscal standpoint. Like we're not getting as much money in as we're giving out. And that's a fundamental imbalance there, that it works when we can bring in money from other industries. We can bring in tax money off oil and gas basically to subsidize this program. That works. But as we saw, we looked into the NBC Universal and Netflix contracts, and we saw provisions in those contracts. These are publicly available. Everyone can go see these, where if the amount of the tax credit payout drops below $50 million in a certain year, these companies can leave. They have that out in their contract. We're touting these as long-term sustainable investments, but they have plenty of outs in their contract, including the ability, I mean, this is essentially a corporation writing policy for us. They're saying, if you ever try to cut this tax credit, we're going to go. And they have that ability. The city of Albuquerque and the state of New Mexico signed those contracts with these people, allowing them to do that. And so if we ever hit a budget crunch, if we have a year where we can't make a payment, if we can't pay out $50 million, these companies are gone. And if we have to choose between funding, say, schools or funding a film tax credit, what are we going to choose there? Are we going to choose to keep these companies around, or are we going to choose to do what government's supposed to do and fund the basic services that we enjoy in this state?
Yeah, that is absolute reality. And folks, if you don't believe us, check out New Mexico Film Production Tax Incentive Study, July 21, 2014. It's a phase 1 report. You can find it repeatedly linked at our heirsofenchantment.com website. You can also find the LFC, Legislative Finance Committee's PowerPoint presentation. But I'll just read. Film production activity, this is from the Film Incentive Report, has produced an estimated 43 cents in state and local taxes, 33 in state, 10 in local, for each dollar in production incentive granted. That means you're losing money. Now, if I were to do a thought experiment, and I gave a presentation at a restaurant, and I said, what would it cost the government, and I'm talking actual cost, not foregone revenue, if, say, a restaurant where we were having a meeting suddenly was given an exemption from every single form of taxation that the state imposed? And the correct answer is, it would cost the state $0. They would lose out on revenue, but they would not be spending more money. So Libertopia happens, and there are zero taxes paid by this particular establishment. Well, that is not the case in film. You are actually spending money. And that kind of thought experiment is the best way I've figured out to get it through people's heads, because the language, the tax credit, the way the industry talks about it and has been able to kind of pull the wool, I think, over a lot of people's eyes has really led to this very bad policy outcome, Danny.
Yeah, absolutely. And you compare it to the Amazon HQ2 thing last year, where they were trying to come to, I think it was Long Island in New York, and there was a huge movement against that. You had Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, one of the kind of figureheads of the new progressive movement, was very much against that, and she and everybody else on the left were able to drive that out of town, and that was only because Amazon was paying nothing in tax. They're paying very little. Their workers still paid tax. They still paid other taxes, but it was income tax they got a lot of breaks on, and some job trading incentives. That was all, and that led to a huge progressive movement against that. You compare that to this, which is even more egregious. You would think that people would be up in arms about this, but it's just they've messaged it very well, and it for a state like this, we don't have too many industries. Our economy is not well diversified. We know that. So on its surface, it seems like this would be an attempt to diversify our economy and bring in a new business sector that could really shake things up and make things kind of move and shake here. But it's too costly, and we're putting our state's budget at risk, and we're crowding out other possible investments we could do just to do this. And so it just isn't worth it when you add it all up.
And at least Amazon.com is a growing company, which
Right.
is okay. That we don't need to talk about which companies are growing, and they may not grow. They could go out of business in 2 years. Who knows? But they were building a permanent headquarters,
Right.
permanently hiring thousands at least of people who are going to work and pay taxes and all those kinds of things. So we could argue whether Amazon was a good deal for New York or not, and we haven't even talked about that at any point previously. But the fact is, at least they would be bringing in real, tangible jobs for the future in New York. Whereas film, one of the things that you've critiqued on it, we've critiqued, is it's very ephemeral. It's not permanent in any way, shape, or form.
Right. Yeah, it's not an investment. An investment is when you put money up front and you get gains down the road. And when you make a tax credit investment, when you're a government and you want to invest in an industry, you put down money up front, you give them money for the first couple of years. We can debate whether or not that's a good thing in general, but an investment is when you put money up front and then down the road, they no longer need that credit. That at some point your investment pays off and you no longer have to keep subsidizing it. So that's how almost every other credit in this country works, and every other government investment should work. If that's what you want to do, that's how a government investment should work. But this is not that. This is not an investment. This is a continuing payout that will happen every year. And if it doesn't happen, these people will leave. I mean, it's ephemeral. It's as you
Now, I
described
want to
it.
talk a little bit more about your own personal experience and kind of the process of making movies and the film that you made for us on this topic. But before we get there, we have to talk about one more aspect of the corporate welfare benefits given to Hollywood film, which is not the film subsidy at all, but in this case is another program that the Rio Grande Foundation has rightly critiqued. LEDA is the big one, Local Economic Development Act, which also involves cutting checks to corporations. But we have a long history of actually funding studios in this state.
Oh yeah.
So before I hand the ball over to you, because I know you've done some work on the NBC Universal deal, but we've rapidly devolved in this particular area because once upon a time I went on a tour of the Albuquerque studios at Mesa del Sol. It's where they filmed Christian Bale cursed somebody out there. That's all I know about that facility. But Christian Bale, of course, played Batman, and that was built with private dollars in Albuquerque to receive subsidies indirectly through the film program. Then you had, and that's why they gave me the tours, to lobby me to engage against the Santa Fe studios, which I don't think they were receiving LEDA. Maybe they were. It was a combination of state and local at the Santa Fe level, county, I believe, subsidies to build that studio, which is up near the old state pen and the new state pen up there in Santa Fe. And then now, this year, in 2019, San Juan County, possibly because they felt sorry for them for what they're doing on the Energy Transition Act and the coal-fired plant, they gave them flat out $1 million of capital outlay, in part to build a new Hollywood studio up in San Juan County. And then there's the NBC Universal deal. So talk about other areas of government subsidy that the film industry benefits from, especially with the prism of the NBC Universal deal?
Oh yeah, where do I start? I mean, there's layers to this. It's not just the tax credit. The tax credit is obviously the kind of headline government welfare, corporate welfare aspect in this.
The gateway drug?
Yeah, because, right, exactly. Gets you hooked, and then the rest just, But yeah, there's LEDA, there's JTIP. NBC Universal is the 5th biggest recipient of JTIP funds in the state as of 2018. There's plenty of other corporate welfare programs that they engage in. It's a whole suite of economic development incentives that this industry takes advantage of. I don't think that the film industry, as far as I'm aware, has put a single penny into any of the studios in the state. It's all been taxpayer money. Santa Fe Studios, I think you mentioned, was privately financed, but it was also underwritten, or at least there was a lot of work that came in from the city of Santa Fe as well to that. I don't think there's any studios here that I can think of except for actually the old Santa Fe University of Art and Design Garson Studios, where they did Longmire, which was just that was there from the College of Santa Fe, and that had been built in the past. I think that was renovated by the company that owns the college for a while. But other than that, I think every other studio in the state was financed with taxpayer money. So the industry hasn't made any, to my knowledge, any real capital investments in those things. And that's the thing. That's what they do, is they don't have to actually plant roots here to do that. You would look at any other industry, and they would have to make capital investments in land and buildings and machinery and all those sorts of things that would actually kind of tie you down and anchor you in a state that you come in and get benefits with, that would prevent you from leaving or make it costly to leave if you want to. But the industry has not actually done any investments like that would anchor it here. It's all been taxpayer funded.
Now let me kind of narrow in again on that NBC Universal. Now, I didn't catch if you described it. Their lease payments for their 10 years of being here are essentially paid for through the LEDA program.
It's 100% paid for through LEDA. Yeah, exactly. So the property was bought up by a private group in Albuquerque called Garcia Realty, and they are getting paid through the state. Basically, they bought it for I think it's $2.4 million a few years back in 2017. And they're getting paid, I'd have to look at the exact, it's a little over I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, 1 and some change million per year for 10 years. So the LEDA funding is covering the cost of leasing that building entirely. So there's no actual, NBC Universal has claimed they're going to make some investments to improve the place. Garcia Realty has done the same, but there isn't anything that's broken down or very granular or very specific about what they're doing to make that happen.
Yeah, I think they're getting $10.6 million total.
Yeah, exactly.
Total, and I think the total amount of the lease comes to right around $11 million.
Right.
So maybe not 100%, but dang close to it. And when you're talking about that trivial of an amount of money, it's basically 100%. So, all right. So you are a guy who likes film, who's in film, but you have problems with the way New Mexico dishes out subsidies. So what do you do? Well, breaking news, Danny made a film about film.
That's right.
And subsidies.
That's right.
So we played this a little bit on the air. We're not going to do it right now. You got to go to, you can go to the Rio Grande Foundation website and go to our YouTube channel, which is available there on our website. But talk about not only the film itself that you made and what you were trying to achieve with that, but kind of the creative process and how you go about making a film like that for YouTube. It's on YouTube. That's where you can really find it.
Mm-hmm. Well, we had talked about this on my first day of working with you, and you gave me a lot of leeway, so I appreciate that. I had done research on it, and I looked at, I think that corporate welfare and this idea that government is picking winners and losers in the economy is something that actually has bipartisan appeal. I think that that's something that we can all get behind. We can recognize, regardless of your political orientation, we can recognize that's something that doesn't benefit the majority of people. That's using government as a pocketbook or a purse, rather, to kind of extract benefits for a certain industry. And I don't think that, whether that unites people as diverse as, say, Charles Koch and Bernie Sanders. I mean, people on both sides of the ideological spectrum are against this. Ralph Nader actually wrote a great book against corporate welfare called Unstoppable a few years back, where he criticizes it and says it's ruined capitalism, essentially. And really, in a lot of ways, it has. It's made people, I think, distrustful of the political process, and it's made a lot of young people distrustful of capitalism because they think that this is capitalism. They look at this cronyism and they see that as the inevitable result of a capitalist system. And so we wanted to produce something which had some bipartisan appeal so that people wouldn't just look at this and say, oh, this is just a Rio Grande Foundation thing. This is, and they put it in a mental box and say, okay, this is just some, libertarian or right-wing sort of thing. I wanted to make something that could really emphasize the fact that this is a bipartisan issue and kind of cut through some of the, I think, the political, I don't want to say propaganda, but the political messaging that the film industry has done so well, which is that the only people who are against this are like toadies of the oil and gas industry. It's like I wanted to kind of push past the narrative because the film industry has been able to control the narrative of this so well that I wanted to push back against that and really show this as an issue which should unite people against this form of government handout. And so I went through and I found, and my job in that was helped by finding a lot of people on both sides of the spectrum. There's a lot of liberal talking points in there as well. There's John Oliver, there's Bernie Sanders, there's plenty of people from both sides of the spectrum that were very much explicitly against this. John Oliver did a great bit about film subsidies in particular, emphasizing the low return on investment and the poor ways that this is messaged to people and the way that it kind of takes advantage of taxpayers. It's something that you may not expect if you are the kind of person that sees this as a left-right issue. As some people do, they say this is, they're on our side of the tracks. So we support film industries because, we're progressives or we're liberals. So we're going to support this automatically without thinking too much about it. If you see people on your side of the tracks who are questioning this, I think it is more effective as from a messaging standpoint. If you can show that it's not really a left-right issue, it's an issue of the supporting the people and the taxpayers against just the whims of people who are going to take advantage of government and use it as a purse to get money out for their business. And so that was kind of the creative thought that went into it. I did a lot of research looking around at different YouTube videos and research papers and everything that came out from both sides. And we kind of landed on this, this video, which was meant to emphasize the corporate welfare aspects of the film credit without really, I didn't want to, I don't begrudge anyone who takes advantage of the film tax credit, as I said before. I have a lot of friends in the film industry. I know that this is a credit that's personally helped me in the past. I've worked on films that have taken advantage of the credits. I know that I can attribute some jobs that I've had to it. So I can't begrudge anyone for taking advantage of it. It's the logical thing to do. It's a great deal for film programs, as I said. So I didn't want to come at this saying, oh, we don't want film in New Mexico. We do want film in New Mexico. We just want sustainable film in New Mexico. We want film that's generated here and benefits the people here most, and film that doesn't crowd out other industries, and film that has an emphasis on the local and the people here and the artists here and the creativity we have in New Mexico rather than simply being kind of a colony of Hollywood.
That's awesome. And you have, despite your stance in work on this issue, have worked on some film projects here in New Mexico. I don't know if you can disclose those publicly, but there are projects that are even willing to bring aboard somebody like yourself. Now, I suspect they're not receiving the subsidy program because I don't know. You tell me. You've been doing some work in New Mexico aside from your work for the Rio Grande Foundation, right?
Oh yeah, I haven't worked on a big set, Hollywood set, in a couple of years. It's been since I think the last one I did was 2016. I typically work on the independent side, as I said, and I run my own little business doing films and videos and everything. So I come at it more from the side of someone who's had to be a producer and director and everything before. Rather than trying to go the route. A lot of my friends from film school went the route of trying to get in on the big sets and start as a PA and work your way upwards. And I just didn't, that was never really something I wanted to do. It wasn't the path I wanted to take with this. I value the independence of being able to be creative and do whatever you like and to make whatever videos and films you can raise money for, essentially, and put things together for. So that was the path I wanted to take with this. I've worked on a couple where I know they've claimed the credit, and so yeah, like as I said, I can't begrudge anyone who takes that credit on. It's a great deal. Most recently, I did an independent film. I was the first AD for an independent film that shot earlier this year.
Sorry,
assistant director.
Okay,
yeah. basically the set manager.
right.
So handling all the creative types.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Well, and that's really good that you've still got opportunities to engage with the industry and engage in that political, that creative process, despite your political stance, your very courageous political stance, because, myself, the Rio Grande Foundation, we've never gotten a dime. We've never expected a dime from the film industry, and we've never really had to put anything at stake. And once you look at the numbers, you look at the data, there's no way that I could go to bed at night without raising red flags and saying, this is not the way government is supposed to work. This is not something that is going to help New Mexico's economy for the long run. So I appreciate the fact that you've been willing to make that a public stance and even make a film about it and detailing all those kinds of things. So
yeah, what's the old saying? You can grow oranges in Maine with enough subsidies, but it's not a good idea,
Exactly. So you're an MBA and you've got a background in film. Do you have plans to stick with the film thing? I know, we won't get into it, but you're not going to be in the state of New Mexico for family reasons, at least for a little while, starting down the road. Your future destination, as I understand it, is not a hotbed of film, but is it more on the business side, traditional, going into the traditional 9-to-5 business community, or do you still want to stick with the whole film thing?
I don't know if I'll ever be full 9-to-5, but definitely getting something a little more stable. I'm married now, and looking to raise a family at some point. It was just the hours it took to be on set all that time. It was tough. It was a lifestyle that worked out great when I was in my 20s, but eventually I'd like to get something a little more stable, be able to, because film is also pretty feast or famine. You'll work a ton for a couple months and then have nothing for the next 4 or 5 months. So I'd like to be able to get something a little more stable going forwards. So we'll see what happens.
I guess I'm curious, talk about the people you find on a film set here in New Mexico. Obviously the big budget ones is one thing, but you've got the Brad Pitts and the big names, the Arnold Schwarzeneggers, et cetera. And those guys get paid, or gals get paid, a ton of cash. But a lot of the New Mexicans who are involved in these roles, with the exception of Stephen Michael Quezada, who really became a bit of a star with the Breaking Bad series, a lot of these are pretty marginal in the way of career work, but that's in front of the camera. You've got behind the camera. Talk about, though, the New Mexicans who are actually involved in this industry, and kind of pencil out some of the financials and how it works for these folks, whether it's in front of or behind the camera.
Yeah, I always look at the kind of the limousine liberals in Hollywood and say, if you really want to walk the walk, when you're talking about, you're going to talk about political things and labor rights, let your PAs unionize, because there's a huge, and this is even counted in the MNP study that looked at the workers in New Mexico who were working on film. They counted a lot of what they call supporting jobs and ancillary jobs that work alongside. When they tout the numbers, they talk about the union jobs, which pay great. Union jobs pay fantastic. You can work as a union costumer, electrician, all those things, get paid, 45,
Are those people generally New Mexicans, or are they coming from other states?
A lot of them are. I would not know how many people come from other states. I was on the last big set that I was on, probably about 60-70% were from out of state. But that was an independent film that was, it was about an $80 million budget, but it was an independent film. It wasn't affiliated with the studio. It's hard to tell. And the film office won't release numbers on this really. They do release numbers, but they don't release it, that they're not granular enough that anyone can double check what they're saying.
And people don't have Zia symbols tattooed on their foreheads.
Some do, yeah.
Not many.
There's a couple.
Certainly not in front of the camera unless they're filming some really weird prison movie.
Right.
But
it's difficult to tell. I wouldn't really know. I wouldn't be able to make a good guess. But the thing is, like, and I think this is well known to some degree, which is that a lot of the key creative talent comes from out of state. The big name decisions, the producers, the directors, the writers, and all those people typically come from out of state. Now, there's exceptions to that. The big name talent comes from out of state. There's exceptions to that for sure. But for the most part, most of these people are coming out, which is actually why you see the hospitality industry being one of the biggest supporters of the film credit, because they bring in people from out of state and rent rooms. So that's a big element there. A lot of the film training programs, they're doing a great job at teaching people. They're getting them into the union roles. And so a lot of in industry parlance, it's called below the line, where it's the people that aren't in the key creative decision-making roles, but they're the people that come on and work as electricians, for example, look at carpenters, all those sort of things, costumers. The preponderance of those, if not the outright majority, are New Mexicans. But there are a significant number of people who do come from out of state. The film I was working on back in 2016, we had PAs coming in. Those are the people who make $10 an hour. We had some of those coming in from Los Angeles. And I don't know if that film itself was just an aberration, but from my general experience, there's a significant portion of the population does come in from out of state, stay seasonally. A lot of them will stay long enough here to get residency. They'll stay 8 to 12 months and then they'll move back eventually. So it's a highly mobile workforce. I would like to see, my ideal, if I could build a film industry from scratch without a credit, it would be 100% New Mexicans. It would be people in key creative roles that would want to stay here when the film is done. Unfortunately, the way the tax credit has incentivized this, that's not really what has happened. It's a fairly stable workforce of people who mostly work below the line, and then key creatives that come in from out of state. Now, once again, there's plenty of exceptions to that. I'd say that almost the majority are New Mexicans that work below the line here. But there's a lot of jobs that are supporting jobs as well. The PA jobs are not union. Those are mostly, if not all, New Mexican. Those I mentioned, there's some exceptions that come in from out of state. Those jobs don't really get counted. They don't get touted as much in the media about this because they make minimum wage, and you work 12 to 14 hours a day, and there aren't really any. There are very few and very difficult upward career mobility prospects. You're working as a PA. People work as a PA for 10, 15 years and they don't go anywhere with it. They'll go up to a key PA and make $14 an hour, but it's not like the career path with that is not very like there's PAs who make it. Don't get me wrong. They go into usually the AD department, assistant director department, and things like that. But there'll also be people who go for the long haul and stay in that position. Same with actors. There'll be people who make a living doing backgrounds, and they'll make, minimum wage. They'll make a couple $100 in a day, and that's what they'll do. And basically the incentive that's dangled in front of you is this could be your opportunity to break into the industry. But it really, a lot of times, doesn't work that way. That's kind of the big myth that the film industry uses to get people into these jobs.
So one last question, and we only have a minute or so
Sure.
to wrap up, so I'll have to keep it short for you. But the politics of the film industry, is it just inherently liberal, or are there people who you meet on these sets that are conservative? I know the film union is very strong, and it seems like the film industry may be having an impact on New Mexico's political dynamic as a state, moving Californians in. So real quick, I know it's a big question, but what's your take on the politics inherent in the film industry itself and how it moves political culture?
Well, it's divided. The above the line creative types, especially the California types, are very coastal liberal, classic, as we know, the progressive types. There's a big kind of white collar, blue collar divide though with the above the line, below the line people. And a lot of the people below the line are some of the greatest people I know. They're blue collar people who just want to work hard and make a good day's living and go home. They typically tend to be a lot more diverse in their viewpoints versus the ones that come in from out of state, typically from the coasts, who are pretty lockstep in with the countrywide, nationwide progressive movement. But the people who are here, and typically the ones who work the below the line positions, are a very diverse group. And obviously they mostly support the union because it's what gets them work, but they're a very diverse group ideologically. So I think it's something that, like I said, it's not a monolith. There's people of all stripes in there.
All right, Danny Seymour, thank you very much. To see his film that he made, a 4-minute or so YouTube video, you can go to the Rio Grande Foundation website, click on our YouTube channel, and see that film. It's what's it called? Name again is corporate.
Something about, do we give out corporate welfare in New Mexico?
Yep, that is, as I recall, right. It's not directly a film
something about
subsidy related title. Thank you for listening to this week's podcast. Make sure to get the latest edition of Tipping Point New Mexico by subscribing at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify. You can post or comment on this and other episodes on Facebook and Twitter, and tell Google Home to play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.